Hey y'all, thought a lot of people say I should make a video breaking down the creative process for writing and practicing the licks that I post over my Instagram page. This video is going to be exactly that, specifically for my most recent post of my lick entitled Chromatic Aberration. Before we get started, if you guys like this kind of content, please show some support by liking and commenting on the video, subscribing to my channel here on YouTube, and checking out my Instagram page where I post the finished products of this lick and a bunch more like it, and a whole bunch of other stuff over there. I'll have a link to my Instagram down in the comments. All the support is greatly appreciated, and your feedback always means a lot to me. Alright, enough the chit-chat, let's get right into it. Little side note as well before I dig into this. I'm pretty new to this whole video editing thing, so please feel free to drop some feedback down in the comments. Along with that, I also just forgot to hit record until I had written the first few beats of the bar, so that's fun. Anyways, typically for my snare licks, I start with a completely blank slate and kind of just develop as I go. Sometimes, as was the case for this one, I took a couple videos the night before with some ideas I had for some phrasing the lick. For these first two bars, the starting idea was different spots of steep dynamic jumps and contrast, and more so playing around with a lot of different stuttering rhythmic ideas and contrast between quick bursts of rhythm and odd spaces and gaps. As far as my process for coming up with the rhythms and more intricate details, it really depends. I usually have a general idea of the notes that I'm playing, with the general speed and feel of it already in my head and in my muscle memory. And then when I go to put everything in the MuseScore, my goal is to make it as close to the feel and flow that I want, usually to a very particular degree. My initial version of the beginning of this lick was a lot more rounded and more normalized in terms of the rhythms and hand speed changes. It's a lot easier to nail in how I want the rhythms to sound once I'm in MuseScore, in this case with the stuttery feel and use of space. Over time while writing, I can tweak the rhythms to approach that specific feel using the MuseScore playback to see how I like it. The third bar here plays with a much more fluid and rounded idea to the rhythms, contrasting the beginning of the lick. Using the large polyrhythm that runs almost the whole length of the bar, I find it easier to have the rhythms run into each other and flow better. There's still the concept of jumps and hiccups, but with a different feel than the beginning, using the slight hiccups up in hand speed rather than jumps up using space and odd big rests. The rest of this lick, and most of what I write as a whole, continues with these same ideas of using polyrhythms as a medium to develop unique and effective ways to flow a piece. This part with the floppies and flam taps uses one method of this where I have polyrhythms back to back of very close and similar hand speeds, but just enough difference to give the phrase an almost accelerando-esque feel. There are other cases, like in the beginning of the lick, where the same techniques of polyrhythm can be used to promote the opposite effect, a feel of limping or stuttering through the rhythms of the phrase in an unpredictable manner. Honestly, this vastness of different ways you can use polyrhythms is probably the biggest thing that drives me to appreciate it. There's practically nothing you can't do with rhythms at this level of understanding. I'm sure it's pretty noticeable, but I've got a lot of ideas that I like to reuse, like my own motifs, sort of like different rudiments and different passages I use a lot. Things like the moving threes and these buzz diddle passages. I like to sprinkle things like that into a lot of what I write as a sort of signature. This part and another part at the end of the lick ended up being changed after I was finished recording all of the footage for this video, so the version of the final edit is slightly different. For this one, I was playing around with ideas of repetition and differentiating speeds and rhythms, but listening back the next day I thought it was a little much, and changed some of it so the motif started, went somewhere else with a different idea, and then it popped back in the middle of the phrase, and I ended up liking that style of repetition a lot better. I felt like it worked a lot better with how it was flowing the piece. This bar here takes a similar idea as in bar 3 with the super long overarching polyrhythm, similar use of hiccups, and then that idea of repetition again throughout the bar. I end up going with this kind of left-hand kick into a low transition with the rhythm of being kind of staggered and unpredictable. The repetition of it seems a lot more exciting, I think, when the reuse cases are slightly or even drastically differed, but still give the same vibe and intent as the original use. This sixlet drag thing here is a good example of something I do pretty often when I'm running my licks, being that the part right after, which is just a 3 decrescendoed notes down to the edge, I wanted to be pretty much the exact same rhythm as the sixlet drags before it. You can probably imagine how it'd be hard to do that with the sixlet being nested inside another bizarre tuplet, but it's actually not that hard. It's just a little bit of math. I use the ratios and the polyrhythms to calculate how many of that rhythm would be in a single beat, bar, or 16th note, something like that, and then use that as a sort of conversion rate to find a polyrhythm to put after it that would yield the same hand speed as a result. It's pretty neat. The last 2 bars until the ending, again, use the recurring idea of hiccups and an overarching polyrhythm that I think works very well in this case, to provide a steady flow and feel again, with the last bar kind of turning into a ram of sorts, ending that last crescendo, which I felt was a cool touch to end the lick on an up. This ending portion was also changed after I finished recording all of this footage. The original part just didn't really feel like the right way to end it, so I tweaked it a little bit the next day into a version I ended up liking just a lot better. Short little note, this here is one example of how I often have an idea of what I want to play, but not always exactly how I want it to sound. In this case, I mess around with different relationships between these smaller rhythms in the passage, and it takes quite a bit of tweaking to arrive at something I'm satisfied with. Of course, this ending was literally only because I thought it would be funny. Writing 1 to 117 or 107, or even just 1 to 1 that's just a quarter note, is completely pointless. But that's kind of the beauty of it in my eyes. If you're not doing something just because you want to, what's the point of doing it all? That's kind of how I see that, at least in this scenario. I also take pride in doing things that nobody else is doing, down to the small little visual details and textures like a gawk buzz into a cross stick, or in the case of my last quad lick that I posted on Instagram, ending the lick with a scraped buzz across drum 2 to 4. Something that I've never really seen, but it's just a little neat touch I like to put into things. So after I'm done writing out the structure and rhythms of a lick, I then go back and hit all the smaller details. In this case, I start by going through and writing all the stickings, fix the formatting of the page to make it look the way I want to, write in some dynamic shaping and expression to emphasize the musicality and flow I'm going for, and finally write in any notes of zonage or visuals or anything else like that. Once I'm done with all the writing and page formatting, the next step in my process is to create the MP3 track to play along to. I typically create a separate MuseScore file for this, where I'll go through and nitpick how the dynamics sound. MuseScore can both be pretty flat in terms of shaping and also sometimes buggy with how the sound comes out. And I'm very picky with how I want my videos to sound, so I fiddle around with it a lot to make sure it sounds right. Then of course, I add the metronome after I'm done with that and export the MP3 file. The final step before I start practicing and recording is that I'll make another separate MuseScore file for my practice track. A lot of people are always curious how I practice my licks, and this is most of it right here. I'll make a separate track like the MP3 with the metronome behind it, and then start by playing each bar one at a time, typically twice through. After 2 reps of each bar alone, I'll move on to chunks. Usually, depending on tempo and time signature, it's about 3 bars at a time. Also in the same 2 reps each for. Finally, I put a full rep of the lick at the very end so I can just run the track down to build consistency and correct interpretation of the music. Now that I've shown you all how I make the practice track, here's a short example from when I was actually preparing for this recording. Alright, so I hope you all enjoyed this breakdown of my writing process. This video took a lot of time, so please show the video some support if you enjoyed it, and go follow my Instagram page for all my shorter form content and links over there. Links in the description. Now, without further ado, I present to you my latest lick, Chromatic Aberration.